Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this press conference sponsored by the Executive Intelligence Review. My name is Webster Tarpley, and I am a contributing editor of Executive Intelligence Review. Today we want to look into the causes and background of the recent tragic bloodletting in the area of Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidian compound. We're interested in exploring the causes in a way that the mass media and congressional investigations so far have failed to do. We wish to focus our attention in particular on the decisive importance of the networks of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith and the Cult Awareness Network. And we will show you that at every decisive turn in the tragic chain of events in Waco, it was these ADL and CAN networks that provided crucial input leading towards the tragic results. And this stretches from the background of the failed February 28th raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms through the April 19th events. However, as you see from the invitation to our proceedings this morning, we are interested simultaneously in going even deeper. And in this regard, we want to show you the importance of the ongoing San Francisco scandal as a window on the causes of what happened in Waco. I'm referring here to a very large scandal which has already been the cause for 2 police raids on the headquarters of the Anti-Defamation League in San Francisco. This is the scandal associated with the former San Francisco police intelligence officer Gerard, the FBI liaison there, and the so-called art dealer and self-styled master spy Roy Bullock. And according to all indications, what went on in San Francisco was the theft of privileged government information from federal and state law enforcement databases, which was then, according to all indications, sold by the ADL to governments such as Israel, South Africa, and in all likelihood others in the world. This San Francisco case is perhaps one of the clearest ways to understand the pervasive pattern of corruption, infiltration, and indeed penetration of the federal and state law enforcement agencies by private criminal groupings, organizations, and networks. And we will try to present it to you in that form. One other point that I would like to make here at the beginning is the comparison of the Waco events to the Bay of Pigs debacle back in 1961, which of course took place at almost exactly the same point in the young presidency of John F. Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs invasion was of course the brainchild of the networks of the Dulles brothers, the surviving Dulles brother in particular, Allen Dulles. The project of invading Cuba at that time was sold to President Kennedy based on a series of lies and exaggerations. And in the wake of the failure of the Bay of Pigs action on the part of the United States, President Kennedy was obliged to proceed to a sweeping purge of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, and other parts of the United States federal government. And it is certain in historical retrospect that the fight to purge those responsible for the Bay of Pigs was an absolutely indispensable phase in the struggle of John F. Kennedy to be President of the United States, since we all know that that is not simply a matter of getting elected and moving into the quarters in the White House. It does require a struggle with entrenched and corrupt networks, holdovers sometimes from previous administrations. Now, we're fortunate in our investigations to be joined by 2 of the leading correspondents of Executive Intelligence Review. We have, first of all, with us Jeff Steinberg, who is the counterintelligence editor of the Executive Intelligence Review, one, I think, of the leading experts on the Anti-Defamation League anywhere in the world. He is the co-author of a very powerful and very popular book entitled The Ugly Truth About the Anti-Defamation League. He will give us, first of all, a series of insights about the San Francisco side of the story. And we will then proceed, using San Francisco again as a window on Waco. We will then hear from our second speaker, Harley Schlanger. Harley Schlanger is the Houston Bureau Chief of Executive Intelligence Review. He covers the entire Southwest, but has also in the past been a chronicler of financial scandals, the savings and loan affairs in all parts of the United States, and indeed internationally. So let me introduce our first speaker, Jeff Steinberg, counterintelligence editor of EIR.
Thank you, Webster. On January the 8th, some of you may recall that EIR had a press conference in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club to announce the release of the book, The Ugly Truth About the ADL. And one of the points that was made in that book was the ADL's efforts at infiltrating and subverting local law enforcement throughout the United States. We talked about lavish recruitment junkets to Israel for selective police chiefs and sheriffs across the United States, intelligence sharing, ADL private funding of informant operations of local police strapped by budget crises. At the time that we called for an investigation into those kinds of practices by the ADL, we were unaware of the fact that already such an investigation was ongoing in San Francisco. It had been initiated in 1990 by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and in the late fall of 1992, it was principally turned over to the San Francisco Police Department and San Francisco District Attorney's Office. In fact, 7 days after the press conference here in Washington, on January 15th, the San Francisco scandal broke publicly, with revelations first in the San Francisco Chronicle and then much more detailed reporting in the San Francisco Examiner beginning the next day, that there had indeed been raids on the San Francisco and Los Angeles offices of the ADL on December 10th, 1992, as well as raids on the home of Roy Bullock, a 40-year full-time employee of the ADL, and Tom Gerard, a San Francisco police officer who had been working as a, in effect, paid operative of the ADL. So, since those initial revelations were made in the local press out there, I have made 2 trips out to the West Coast. I've spoken with investigators, I've spoken with reporters, I've met with representatives of some of the community groups that were victims and targets of the ADL spying. Our own San Francisco and Los Angeles EIR bureaus discovered that they had been targets of ADL spying, and in fact, several of our people out in California are now participants in a class action suit that was filed last month by a former United States Congressman, Paul McCloskey, claiming a wide range of damages as the result of spying by the ADL. Now, much of what I've said so far may very well come as a surprise to many of you here, because with the exception of just a few scant newspaper articles and one ABC World News Tonight broadcast, the major newspapers in the Washington, D.C. area have thoroughly shunned this scandal, despite the fact that, as you'll discover in the next few minutes, this is perhaps one of the most significant espionage and criminal conspiracy cases to emerge in recent years here in the United States. The Washington Times ran 2 abbreviated Scripps Howard wires off of San Francisco Examiner stories. The Washington Post ran 1 very brief article which was highly favorable to the ADL's efforts to damage control and limit the expose of this story. So if you rely on the local media here in Washington, you know virtually nothing about what is actually going on. The first thing I think that is essential to understand about this scandal is that it is not a local West Coast or San Francisco scandal. The investigations so far that have been conducted by the San Francisco Police and the District Attorney's Office have turned up evidence of major involvement of ADL figures in Washington, D.C. and in New York City at their main headquarters. In fact, on April the 8th of this year, the San Francisco Police conducted a second court-authorized raid on the ADL's offices in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, and carted off additional documents, including internal ADL memoranda, including financial records, and what's been stated so far publicly on terms of the fruits of that April 8th raid. It's rather limited, but what is stated publicly is the fact that evidence is now in the possession of the DA's office showing that all of the spying activity conducted out on the West Coast was micromanaged by the head of the ADL's nationwide fact-finding department headquartered in New York City, a man named Erwin Sewell, who has been in that position with the ADL since the late 1960s. There are both financial trails as well as paper trails now in the possession of the San Francisco authorities showing that most of the illegal activities carried out by Roy Bullock and others on the West Coast was done under the specific orders of Sewell, and that Sewell received detailed reports on a timely basis on the results of all of the illegal spying activities. Here in Washington, D.C., the head of the fact-finding department of the ADL is a woman named Mira Lansky Boland. In May of 1991, she organized an all-expenses-paid junket to Israel for 11 police officers from various police departments across the United States. Among the participants in that junket were Tom Girard, the San Francisco police officer who's now one of the primary targets of the local investigation on the West Coast. Other police officers from the West Coast were along on this. A local sheriff in Loudoun County, Virginia, named Donald Moore, who was very familiar to us because he was recently indicted and prosecuted in a famous kidnapping case involving the Cult Awareness Network, the ADL, and an effort to kidnap two associates of EIR and Lyndon LaRouche, Louis DuPont Smith and his wife, Andrea Diano Smith. Mira Lansky Boland was, in effect, one of the leading Anti-Defamation League unindicted co-conspirators in the Jonathan J. Pollard espionage case back in 1985. And this is one of the things that I'll be happy to go over in detail a bit later in my discussion, and could even go into more detail on during the question and answer period if people are interested. But let me just go back to what has already come out in the public record as the result of the San Francisco investigation and other court actions that have involved the ADL over the years. These 4 loose leaf volumes that are standing up here next to me at the podium represent documents that have emerged in the public record as the result of the San Francisco investigation since just January of this year. These 2 volumes are 700 pages of material released on April 8th by the San Francisco Police Department. These are the affidavit that was submitted by Inspector Roth from the San Francisco Police Department and accompanying documents in order to obtain the search warrant for the April 8th raid. These include interrogations of Roy Bullock and another former ADL official from Los Angeles named David Gervitz. What they reveal is, number one, that the ADL was regularly receiving classified government documents from the San Francisco Police Department, from the FBI nationwide computer criminal database, from the California State Department of Motor Vehicles, and other agencies. This material was being systematically taken from the police computers, not because the individuals who were targeted were involved in any criminal activity or were targets of any criminal investigation, but simply because they were on the political target list of the ADL. In at least one case, we know that this illegally obtained data was passed on to the Israeli government, and an American citizen from Chicago, Illinois, was illegally detained in Israel by the Israeli government on charges of financing terrorism. That material was generated by the ADL and in part based on illegally obtaining police and other government files. We know that a number of people whose files were illegally gotten from the police records and other government files for the ADL through these local police officials were activists in the anti-apartheid movement. The ADL operative Roy Bullock and the former San Francisco police officer Tom Girard received at least $16,000 in cash payments from agents of the government of South Africa to provide these surveillance files on anti-apartheid activists. In fact, one of the documents that's contained in these bound volumes that was released by the police department in San Francisco is a list of 950 U.S. domestic political organizations that were all being spied on by the ADL. Those files were being shared with the Israeli government. They were being shared with the South African government as the result of an agreement authorized by FBI Director at the time William Webster in February of 1985. The FBI was regularly receiving information gathered by the ADL in apparent violation of many guidelines on FBI spying activity that were set as the result of the COINTELPRO and other illegal government spying scandals of the 1970s. So in effect, the ADL was operating as a subterranean illegal branch of the U.S. government, was funneling material to the Israeli government on a regular basis, was spying on American citizens for the government of South Africa, and was even spying on many organizations within the Jewish community itself that were operating on behalf of policies that the ADL was opposed to. Most specifically, groups that were supportive of an idea of some sort of a land for peace settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The mayor of Portland, Oregon, a woman who was born on a kibbutz in Israel, named Vera Katz, was a target of spying by the ADL. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, which the ADL considered to be a rival group, was spied upon. One of the members of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles was exposed to the White Aryan Resistance Movement, a group in California that the ADL and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had jointly infiltrated a convicted felon into. And there were efforts made to instigate a violent attack, potentially a murder, against the Wiesenthal Center operative by two officials of the ADL, Roy Bullock and David Gervitz. So you have a wide range of crimes: foreign espionage, illegal spying on American citizens, illegal possession of confidential government material, solicitation of murder, being carried out by the ADL on the West Coast, all under the micromanaging eye of Irwin Sewell at the ADL's headquarters in New York City, and with active nationwide troubleshooter involvement by Mira Lansky-Boland of the ADL offices right here in Washington, D.C. This is a scandal of dramatic proportions. One question that comes as the result of just simply reviewing uncontested information in the public record, police files, including interrogations of some of the ADL officials themselves. We've got a situation here where the ADL was illegally spying and perhaps working in league with the FBI, with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, soliciting criminal frame-up investigations against U.S. citizens who were guilty of nothing more than having policy disagreements with the ADL on a variety of issues. Yet, the Washington, D.C. major media has blacked out this story. There has been no sign whatsoever yet of any interest on the part of any office in the United States Congress of taking action on this. We hope that this will be corrected as the result of this press conference and other kinds of meetings and lobbying activities that we're going to be doing on this issue. I want to focus for a moment on the case of Mira Lansky-Boland here in Washington, D.C., because I think it is exemplary of the kind of activity that the ADL engages in on a systematic basis. Mira Lansky-Boland has been the fact finder, which is a euphemism for dirty tricks operator, for the Anti-Defamation League here in the nation's capital since approximately November of 1982. We know a little bit about her career background, and anticipating the question, I'll tell you right now that we're not sure whether she's a blood relative of Meyer Lansky. We're trying to find that out. It wouldn't be surprising, but we're just not sure. Certainly an admirer, yes. Mira Lansky-Boland was a participant in a graduate program in national security studies at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy in Boston. She received a master's degree from there in 1978. The director of that program at the time is an Israeli citizen named Dr. Yuri Ranan. In the mid-1960s, Ranan was an employee of the Israeli government, an intelligence operative for the Israeli government, working under the cover of a public affairs officer, first at the Israeli embassy in Washington, later at the United Nations mission in New York. And one of the projects that Ranan was responsible for in the early 1960s for the Israeli government was the setting up of a Mossad spy ring at the headquarters of the B'nai B'rith, using Anti-Defamation League personnel as the front people for that espionage operation. This was exposed when one of the actual B'nai B'rith officials objected to the idea of the group being used as a spy front for the Israeli government. He was fired. He went to court. There was a lengthy civil suit in which many, many documents were forced into the public court record, identifying Ranan's role as the Mossad case officer for the spy operation into the ADL. It was, in fact, immediately after that suit that Ranan left the Israeli government service, maintained a relatively low profile for a period of years, and then surfaced as the director of this national security studies program up in Boston. That program would, as a matter of course, place all of its graduate students into national security jobs with the U.S. government. In 1978, upon her graduation from that program, Mira Lansky-Boland was placed by Yuri Ranan into a job with the CIA, where she worked for 2 years before transferring to the Department of Defense Office of Net Assessments, and after 2 years there, she went to work full-time for the ADL. Her classmate in that program at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy was Jonathan J. Pollard, who through the same Professor Ranan was placed into a job with Naval Intelligence in Suitland, Maryland. We know that throughout the 1980s, right up to the time of Pollard's arrest for espionage, that Lansky-Boland and Pollard maintained contact through a group called the Third Generation, which was a network of congressional staffers, government intelligence officers with the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon, who all would meet over at the Heritage Foundation offices on a monthly basis and exchange information and swap intelligence stories and things like that. There's evidence that there was a direct kind of operating relationship between Pollard and Mira Lansky-Boland during that period, and that the ADL played a rather central role in the overall Pollard spy operation. We would hope that this would become one of the issues picked up by the local media, by congressional committees, and hopefully even by government investigators as part of this overall look into the ADL's activities. So all of these kinds of things are not matters of speculation. This is not guesswork. This is the concrete fruits of ongoing investigations that either found their way into civil litigations in court, or in the case of the spying on 950 organizations and well over 12,000 American citizens, we have the investigative findings of the San Francisco Police Department to show the exact hard evidence of this kind of criminality. Despite all of this, the ADL still to this day enjoys tax-exempt status from the Internal Revenue Service. They are officially classified by the U.S. government as a tax-exempt charity, despite the fact that the activities that they're engaged in, as documented in these binders here, are anything but charitable. So one of the things that we would very much like to see taken up as part of the congressional review and executive branch review of this scandal would be the ADL's tax-exempt status, which is clearly completely inappropriate and would indicate a degree of collusion between federal agencies, regulatory agencies like the IRS, like the Federal Election Commission, and the leading figures within the ADL. We'd like to see that ended once and for all. Now, I mentioned at the early stages of my remarks here this morning that Mira Lansky-Boland of the Field Office of Washington, D.C. of the ADL sponsored and personally led a junket of local police officers to Israel in May of 1991, and that among the people involved in that junket were Tom Gerard, the San Francisco police officer who has now fled the country and is in hiding in the Philippines and is threatening to reveal all sorts of U.S. government secrets about his activities for the Central Intelligence Agency in the early 80s, when he had a 2-year leave of absence from the San Francisco Police Department. Another person who was along on that junket was a sergeant in the Sheriff's Department in San Diego County named Tim Carroll. Carroll was interviewed by the San Francisco Police Department and confirmed that the officers selected for that junket to Israel in May of 1991 were being paid for, quote, services already rendered to the ADL, and that the purpose of the junket was to put them in contact with senior officials of the Israeli National Police Force, the Israeli Mossad, the Israeli Defense Force intelligence sections, in order to establish what he described as deeper emotional and sentimental ties to the efforts of Israel. In other words, it was a follow-on recruitment junket as well as a payment and insurance of continued collaboration in the ADL's illegal activities. Well, one of the people involved also in that junket from Loudoun County, Virginia, Deputy Sheriff Don Moore, as I indicated, shows up more recently as an active member of the Cult Awareness Network, which is an organization that maintains extremely close working relations with the Anti-Defamation League. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the Cult Awareness Network functions in effect as an operational arm of the ADL, carrying out a range of activities that the ADL would not in any way, shape, or form wish to be caught engaged in. The most specific one being kidnapping for hire, which was the issue in the DuPont Smith case recently. So with that sort of notation of the relationship between the ADL and the Cult Awareness Network, and the fact that that is a ongoing Washington, D.C. area activity, I'd like to, at this point, finish my remarks after Harley Schlanger goes into this Cult Awareness Network role in the Waco massacre. Both of us will be available for questions on any of the matters that I've raised here. People are also welcome at the end of the press conference to come up here and look through some of these documents. And if any reporters are interested in getting copies of that material, we can make arrangements to have that stuff available for you over the next day or so. So with that, I'll just say thank you.
Let me begin by summarizing what we're really looking at, if you think through what Jeff was just reporting and what we've discovered from our preliminary investigations of the Cult Awareness Network in its relationship to the tragedy that took place in Waco, Texas. What we're looking at is a pattern of corruption of federal law enforcement agencies, and in the case of the ADL, the files coming out from San Francisco, of state and local agencies, that stretches back over decades. With the recent publication of Anthony Summers' book and material that's been on file and available for some time, we know that this goes back a number of years to include organized crime involvement in blackmail of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If we look at the patterns that are coming out of San Francisco, we see in the case of Bullock that this stretches back anywhere from 25 to 40 years, depending on the specific case you're looking at. And now we're finding something that I think is probably the most insidious of all, which is a private organization, the Cult Awareness Network, which is moving to impose its agenda on federal law enforcement agencies and doing it in public, in the open, as in the case of the shameless representative from New Jersey, William Hughes, who was badgering both Attorney General Reno and FBI Director Sessions, demanding that they bring the Cult Awareness Network in as the experts on cults, with the idea being, as the Cult Awareness Network says, that we're going to have many, many Wacos in the future, and the existing agencies are not prepared for that. So what we're really looking at is an attempt to impose the agenda of these private agencies. The Anti-Defamation League and the Cult Awareness Network is the most prominent, on official federal law enforcement agencies. And this is what the people of this country should be concerned with, and this is what should be the subject of the investigations that are going on, instead of the dog and pony show that we saw last week with the House Judiciary Committee. I watched some of the hearings with a veteran Houston Police Department SWAT officer. And after we turned it off, he turned to me and he said, imagine if something like this had happened in Houston, and it was a Houston SWAT team that was involved in the so-called rescue operation. And in the process of the negotiations and then the act of attack, there had been the deaths of all the people who were involved, had been held hostage or were in the siege. He said, do you know what would have happened to us? He said there would have been immediate suspensions pending investigation. And the investigation would look at who handled the negotiations, who trained the police, who developed the psychological profile that was used, and how could this have been handled differently? That's not what we're seeing so far in Waco. Some of these questions are coming forward, and some people are bringing them up. But in general, what we're seeing instead is the attempt to use the act, which we'll prove was a criminal act on behalf of the law enforcement agencies, that they're using that to justify the intensification of the procedures that were used that resulted in the deaths of more than 80 people, including 4 federal officers, for the purpose of executing a search warrant. It reminds me of something that I remember from years ago, hearing a military official of the United States talking about a city in Vietnam, and he said we had to destroy the city to save it. Here we had a case where we want to protect children, according to the official agencies, protect children from harm. And in the process, we bashed down their house, pumped in gas, and ended up with an action in which they were all killed. If the result was to, or if the goal of this operation was to protect the children from abuse, and that's a question which has not yet been satisfactorily answered, whether there was abuse or not, that if that was the goal, then I guess in a certain sense it's succeeded, because those children will not be abused again. But it's because of the deaths of those children that we have the responsibility to get to the bottom of this. Who's responsible for this, and how did it happen? And that's what the investigation has to focus on, because these people do deserve a day in court. Now, an investigation has to begin by separating this operation into 2 phases. And I'll just indicate to you some of the areas of investigation, some of the leads that should be pursued in the attempt to get to the bottom of this. The first is phase one, what led up to the February 28th raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And then secondly, phase two is the FBI operation, which began the next day after the initial fiasco on February 28th, in which 4 federal agents were killed, possibly by their own fire. The second phase began March 1st and was brought to a fiery end on April 19th. One of the most important things to look at is this question of who were the sources and the so-called experts. When Janet Reno held her first press conference, she said over and over and over, I consulted the experts. I consulted the best experts we could find. So the question has to be asked, who were these experts? I think we can say fairly conclusively that in the case of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms raid, the experts, so-called, were leading activists and officials of the Cult Awareness Network. In the case of phase two with the FBI, the experts who should be investigated include the people based in Quantico, Virginia, in the so-called Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI and the related hostage response team, the people who were on the scene and conducted the operation. And the third part of this is in the case of Attorney General Reno, who were the people briefing her? That is, who compiled the information and convinced her on the night of Saturday, April 17th, that the only way to end the hostage, the siege in Waco, the only way to end it would be to batter down the walls and pump in a kind of tear gas which is banned for use in warfare by a Geneva Code. Now, in the case of the ATF, the question that we have to look at is how does a private agency, like the Cult Awareness Network, get the power to direct federal law enforcement investigations? Now, the first thing you have to look at is what is the Cult Awareness Network and how does it operate? We have the documentation in the book Travesty of the way in which the Cult Awareness Network was working through the operatives Donnie Moore, who Jeff covered in his presentation, Donnie Moore from the deputy sheriff from Loudoun County, Virginia, how he worked together with a professional so-called deprogrammer named Galen Kelly to plan out the kidnapping of Louis DuPont Smith. Now, the Cult Awareness Network today will tell you that they do not engage in kidnapping. That this is something that some people, some nasty people like Ted Patrick used to do, but the Cult Awareness Network is above this. But the FBI transcripts, that is the transcripts that were got from a wire on one of the collaborators or one of the people brought in by Donnie Moore on the Louis DuPont Smith case, proves that they are still doing kidnapping. And in fact, Galen Kelly, several days after he was acquitted in the DuPont Smith case, was indicted again on another kidnapping, and last week on a horrendous CBS special Street Stories edition, Galen Kelly said on camera he would kidnap again. So he's called it kidnapping. I don't know why this court in Alexandria couldn't find that there was kidnapping involved. What the Cult Awareness Network has done is that it's set up itself as the experts on cults. And this goes back to some of the key people involved in the Cult Awareness Network who, not so coincidentally, turn up in the CIA mind control programs in the 1950s and 60s, codenamed Operation MK Ultra. These were exposed as part of the Church Committee hearings in the late 1970s, and several books and articles have been written about them. These were the programs where so-called psychiatrists were doing investigations on mind control techniques, starting from the Chinese model, the idea of the Manchurian Candidate. But we're also using psychedelic drugs and a number of other kinds of techniques, including sensory deprivation and so on, to come to an understanding, supposedly, of how the mind works. But in fact, they were creating cults. For example, Louis Jolyon West, who was just quoted the other day in the Boston Globe saying that law enforcement officials are too liberal in enforcing and allowing freedom of speech, that we have to give up freedom of speech if we're to protect ourselves from cults. This same Dr. West in the 1950s and 60s was drugging students on campuses, students who were unknowingly being drugged, to do tests of their reaction to psychedelic drugs. West worked with someone named Dr. Margaret Singer, who joins him today on the board of the American Family Foundation, which is a organization directly working and related to CAN, the Cult Awareness Network. Margaret Singer is supposedly an expert on brainwashing. The two of them were involved in the 1960s in programs on Haight-Ashbury Street in San Francisco, which is where the beginning of the so-called counterculture occurred. Now, these same people who are experienced in brainwashing from that work that they did are the ones today who supposedly are the experts on cults. And they're asking that the Justice Department give them an official franchise to determine what group is a cult and what group therefore should be targeted. And this is the group that Representative Hughes, at least twice, both with Attorney General Reno and with FBI Director Sessions, in the public hearing, demanded that the FBI and the Justice Department bring in for consultation. Now, as this refers to Waco, if you look at the pattern around the initial raid, what you find is that the ATF was operating on the basis of a profile provided to them by the Cult Awareness Network. There were three inputs for this. The first, and this is from material that's available in the public, and an investigation should find out what else was done. What were the specific contacts between CAN and ATF officials? But the first were a series of letters sent from former members of the Branch Davidians in Michigan, most likely around the Jewell family there. And what they said in the letters they sent out is that they charged Koresh with, quote, child abuse and neglect, tax evasion, slavery, and reports of possible mass destruction, unquote. This report was sent out to all government agencies and law enforcement officials, even including in Waco, in McLennan County, and in the state of Texas. There were attempts by these family members to get an investigation going locally. And the local officials, who have on several occasions sent people to the compound to investigate charges of child abuse, and who concluded each time that there was no evidence to support that, said that there was no reason to go in for them to be involved. And so then the target became the federal agencies. There was a memo released recently by the Dallas Morning News, a memo from the FBI on February 23rd, 1993, 5 days before the raid against the Branch Davidian compound, in which the FBI, responding to the letters from Michigan with those accusations, said that to date, no information has been developed to verify the allegations. Now, that was one of the inputs. The second input is from a man named Rick Ross. Rick Ross is a CAN deprogrammer with no background in psychology or psychiatry. In fact, his background is that he was a jewel thief. He was convicted in 1975 in Arizona as being someone involved in a $50,000 jewel heist. Rick Ross is a kidnapper. There are warrants out for him in Washington State. There are other people investigating him in California and elsewhere. Rick Ross was involved in deprogramming at least one former member of the Branch Davidians, and he had a contract for a deprogramming of a second one. Rick Ross admitted that he was consulting with the ATF. That was immediately after the first raid. Within 2 days, he was denying that he had been consulting with them, and instead he received a contract to be a consultant for Channel 4 television in Dallas, Texas, where he became the local expert. Rick Ross has been on national television, local television, day after day after day as the so-called expert on the Branch Davidians. And that was the second input from CAN into the ATF. And the third, and perhaps the most curious, comes from Australia, from a private investigator named Jeffrey Hossack. Now, Hossack caused the U.S. State Department office in Melbourne, Australia, a woman named Sandra Stevens, who's a consulate official there, to send a letter to the State Department, which was forwarded to ATF. And what the letter said is, quote, Howell, that is David Koresh, was heading in one of the following directions: a final Jonestown massacre, an armed confrontation with authorities, or some bizarre behavior, such as an attempted assassination of a public figure, end quote. Now, how does an individual private eye in Australia end up getting the State Department to intervene with ATF to push ATF to launch this investigation and attack? Well, Hossack is not just a private eye. He works very closely with the law firm in Australia of Arnold Bloch Liebler. And the Liebler family in Australia is a family which has been exposed in the press there as a Mossad operation, that is Israeli intelligence, and that they work with the Jewish Center in Melbourne, which is an affiliate of the Cult Awareness Network and an affiliate of the Anti-Defamation League, the same network that Jeff was describing. And so from that, it's not just one private eye who's meeting with several former members, but it's an official of this operation who was reporting to the State Department, which then asked that the ATF do something. When the ATF botched the first raid, and the technical side is not of interest right now, we can take that up if people have some questions. In fact, there's much that we don't know yet about what happened on the technical side of this whole thing. But when they were asked, why launch a raid? Why send more than 100 people, well-armed with helicopters, against this compound when it may very well have been that there was a tip-off beforehand? ATF spokesman Jack Kaloran said that the agency concluded that, quote, Koresh would either launch an attack on Waco residents or instigate a mass suicide, unquote. Virtually the same words used by Hossack in the letter that was forwarded by the State Department to the ATF. Now, that represents fairly conclusive leads on the role of the Cult Awareness Network in setting up the ATF in the first place. And it's there that the investigation has to proceed. Now, one additional note on the CAN side of this, the Cult Awareness Network side. Since the conclusion of the standoff, the siege situation on April 19th, Cult Awareness Network leader Cynthia Kisser has appeared on national television, local television, radio shows, in op-eds in major papers, saying that had CAN been included in the full standoff as a full partner in shaping the intelligence and the operations, then this would not have happened. She continued to say there are more than 1,500, maybe as many as 2,500 additional Koresh-style cults, many of which are dangerous. And she has said repeatedly that we must now realize that we cannot allow freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of association for these groups. This was presented by Hughes, Representative Hughes, before the committee, and even Floyd Clark from the FBI said that we cannot set up the kind of spying, the kind of intelligence gathering on people who have committed no crimes. But the Cult Awareness Network is trying to force their view of cults. And a cult for them, it actually is very similar to the idea of a thought crime. Very similar to the idea that the Anti-Defamation League is trying to force through state legislatures on the idea of hate crime legislation. To give to judges, to give to law enforcement officials the responsibility to try to determine the thoughts of a person, and from basing that on the thoughts of a person, preemptively attacking them based on this kind of profile. And that's something that goes directly against the Constitution of the United States. Now in phase 2, and looking at the FBI operation, what we have to look at is the role of Quantico, Virginia, which is where the FBI has its behavioral science unit and the hostage response team. Now it's worth noting that the hostage response team that was deployed against the compound in Waco was also involved in the more than 400-man operation deployed against Lyndon LaRouche in October 1986. that again you have a parallel. You have the Cult Awareness Network and the ADL that were stirring up agencies, planting stories, planting slanders and rumors to build up for a siege which was intended to have the same kind of bloody ending in Leesburg, Virginia, that occurred in Waco, Texas. That this hostage response team operates from the same or a similar psychological profile mapping as the Cult Awareness Network does. There are two people in particular who should be investigated in this. One of whom is Dr. Park Dietz, who is supposedly the top psychological expert working for the FBI. And it is Dietz who has been involved in building the hostage response team. Dietz was on the scene in Waco. Dietz was involved in putting out the line, according to Judge Sessions, that the children were being abused and the children are in danger. A second person who should be investigated is a Dr. Murray Myron, who is a pioneer in something called psycholinguistics. He's a professor at Syracuse University and has been on the payroll on a retainer for the FBI for the last 15 years. Myron from Syracuse, New York, was telling the FBI that there was no need to negotiate any further with Koresh, that the negotiations would not work, that a confrontation was inevitable. Why wait? Myron told an Executive Intelligence Review interviewer that he said that he approved, that he was one of the people who approved the April 19th action. And he said, of all the options, this was the most benign. So you have to consider at least that the guy's judgment is off. But that's what he said, this so-called expert for the FBI. He said the rule of law must be enforced. Society must show its willingness to use force to enforce the rule of law. Clearly, the issue here was not the rule of law in Waco, Texas, but establishing the precedent of brutal repression of groups that are targeted and singled out as cults. And that was what was done when the FBI launched that raid. And there must be investigations into the role of Dietz and Myron and the whole crew of psychological shock troops employed at Quantico, Virginia. Now, finally, I think it's important to look at the evidence that is coming from, or the statements coming from the lawyers in the case. Because in matter of fact, outside of the FBI, the only people in contact with individuals inside the compound during the last 3 weeks of the siege were the lawyers. Dick DeGuerin, a very prominent defense attorney in Houston, Jack Zimmerman, and now there's Mike DeGuerin and several others who were involved. Dick DeGuerin said repeatedly that Koresh does want to come out because he wants his day in court. And the Houston Chronicle ran an article 2 weeks before the final attack, which was an interview with several attorneys, including a former prosecutor and a defense attorney in Houston, all of whom said that the government will have a very difficult case proving its case in court. That is, that the ATF, from what they had in the warrant, which some police officials have said does not constitute probable cause for that kind of action, that they would have a very difficult time proving their case. Well, the negotiating tactics, so-called, that were used, including the blinding lights and the loud music, the hard cop, soft cop tactics, which are typical in this kind of action, and then the final tank and gas assault, meant that the FBI will never have to answer some of these questions. In fact, there's talk of bringing the Cult Awareness Network in to deprogram the former members who survived. And in fact, one of the Cult Awareness Network members said that they're still programmed, they can't go to court and testify because they still think there was no suicide pact, that there was nothing wrong with what they did, so they can't tell the truth until they've gone through deprogramming. That is absolute interference with the right to a fair trial. On the final case of Attorney General Reno, there's one person in particular I think must be investigated, who was the liaison between the Quantico group and herself, and that is a Deputy Attorney General named Mark Richard. Reno told the committee that it was Richard and Sessions, but mostly Richard, who briefed her during the siege, that it was Mark Richard who went down to Waco to get a hands-on look and also decide who the prosecutor should be in the case. And Mark Richard was one of the small coterie of people who were at the final meeting on April 17th to decide the final tactics. Mark Richard is distinguished by his connection, long-term, to the same Mossad ADL networks as the police operative in San Francisco and as the Cult Awareness Network. He was one of the founders of something called the Office of Special Investigations, which has engaged in the prosecution of alleged former Nazis. And it was Richard's office, as has come out repeatedly now in cases, for example, the Demjanjuk case, who passed on and knowingly passed on forged KGB and Israeli documents to help convict American citizens. The same Mark Richard was in the office with Attorney General Reno when the final decision was made. And because of his connections, again, you see the same thread, the same pattern. And this must be brought up for investigation. As to people like Representative Hughes, who say that we need a special intelligence unit on cults and we should give special leeway to law enforcement in investigation of cults, this is absolutely irresponsible. He's calling for a violation of the Constitution, and he needs to be set straight on this. What we saw was a completely unnecessary catastrophe in which 24 or more children were killed to protect them from abuse, in which a house was burned down because there were suspicions that there were illegal weapons being stockpiled there, in a compound where people had lived at peace with the community for many, many years, where local law enforcement officials said, if you wanted to sign out a warrant against Koresh, why didn't you go to the prosecutor's office? We could have called and arranged some kind of peaceable surrender, as they did in 1988 after a shootout internal within the Branch Davidians.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this press conference sponsored by the Executive Intelligence Review. My name is Webster Tarpley, and I am a contributing editor of Executive Intelligence Review. Today we want to look into the causes and background of the recent tragic bloodletting in the area of Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidian compound. We're interested in exploring the causes in a way that the mass media and congressional investigations so far have failed to do. We wish to focus our attention in particular on the decisive importance of the networks of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith and the Cult Awareness Network. And we will show you that at every decisive turn in the tragic chain of events in Waco, it was these ADL and CAN networks that provided crucial input leading towards the tragic results. And this stretches from the background of the failed February 28th raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms through the April 19th events. However, as you see from the invitation to our proceedings this morning, we are interested simultaneously in going even deeper. Of the leading correspondents of Executive Intelligence Review. We have, first of all, with us Jeff Steinberg, who is the counterintelligence editor of the Executive Intelligence Review, one, I think, of the leading experts on the Anti-Defamation League anywhere in the world. He is the co-author of a very powerful and very popular book entitled The Ugly Truth About the Anti-Defamation League. He will give us, first of all, a series of insights about the San Francisco side of the story. And we will then proceed, using San Francisco again as a window on Waco. We will then hear from our second speaker, Harley Schlanger. Harley Schlanger is the Houston Bureau Chief of Executive Intelligence Review. He covers the entire Southwest, but has also in the past been a chronicler of financial scandals, the savings and loan affairs in all parts of the United States, and indeed internationally. So let me introduce our first speaker, Jeff Steinberg, counterintelligence editor of EIR.
Thank you, Webster. On January the 8th, some of you may recall that EIR had a press conference in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club to announce the release of the book, The Ugly Truth About the ADL. And one of the points that was made in that book was the ADL's efforts at infiltrating and subverting local law enforcement throughout the United States. We talked about lavish recruitment junkets to Israel for selective police chiefs and sheriffs across the United States, intelligence sharing, ADL private funding of informant operations of local police strapped by budget crises. At the time that we called for an investigation into those kinds of practices by the ADL, we were unaware of the fact that already such an investigation was ongoing in San Francisco. It had been initiated in 1990 by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and in the late fall of 1992, it was principally turned over to the San Francisco Police Department and San Francisco District Attorney's Office. In fact, 7 days after the press conference here in Washington, on January 15th, the San Francisco scandal broke publicly, with revelations first in the San Francisco Chronicle and then much more detailed reporting in the San Francisco Examiner beginning the next day, that there had indeed been raids on the San Francisco and Los Angeles offices of the ADL on December 10th, 1992, as well as raids on the home of Roy.
One other point that I would like to make here at the beginning is the comparison of the Waco events to the Bay of Pigs debacle back in 1961, which of course took place at almost exactly the same point in the young presidency of John F. Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs invasion was of course the brainchild of the networks of the Dulles brothers, the surviving Dulles brother in particular, Allen Dulles. The project of invading Cuba at that time was sold to President Kennedy based on a series of lies and exaggerations. And in the wake of the failure of the Bay of Pigs action on the part of the United States, President Kennedy was obliged to proceed to a sweeping purge of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, and other parts of the United States federal government. And it is certain in historical retrospect that the fight to purge those responsible for the Bay of Pigs was an absolutely indispensable phase in the struggle of John F. Kennedy to be President of the United States, since we all know that that is not simply a matter of getting elected and moving into the quarters in the White House. It does require a struggle with entrenched and corrupt networks, holdovers sometimes from previous administrations. Now, we're fortunate in our investigations to be joined by two, and in this regard, we want to show you the importance of the ongoing San Francisco scandal as a window on the causes of what happened in Waco. I'm referring here to a very large scandal which has already been the cause for 2 police raids on the headquarters of the Anti-Defamation League in San Francisco. This is the scandal associated with the former San Francisco Police Intelligence Officer Girard, the FBI liaison there, and the so-called art dealer and self-styled master spy Roy Bullock. And according to all indications, what went on in San Francisco was the theft of privileged government information from federal and state law enforcement databases, which was then, according to all indications, sold by the ADL to governments such as Israel, South Africa, and in all likelihood others in the world. This San Francisco case is perhaps one of the clearest ways to understand the pervasive pattern of corruption, infiltration, and indeed penetration of the federal and state law enforcement agencies by private criminal groupings, organizations and networks, and we will try to present it to you in that form.